All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into something that's pretty vital for you guys, Marine Corps Planning Doctrine,
Specifically MCDP 5.
MCDP 5, exactly. And, we both know planning is absolutely essential in military ops.
Yeah.
Having a good plan can mean the difference between, success or not.
Yeah. Big time.
And we know that. And we also know that, neither of us has ever worn the uniform, but we both spent a lot of time really digging deep into this MCDP 5 doc
Yeah.
to try to pull out the most important, actionable stuff that we can give back to you guys.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing that we found about MCDP 5 is that it's not like, some rigid step-by-step manual.
Right.
It's more like it gives you like a framework for thinking about planning in the real world.
Yeah, the real world of war.
The real world of war, exactly, which is
A little chaotic.
chaotic and constantly changing.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the first things that really stood out to us was how MCDP 5 emphasizes the process of planning. It's not just a one-time thing.
Right. It really drives home the fact that planning is a cycle.
Yeah.
You're constantly assessing the situation, you're setting goals, figuring out how to achieve those goals, evaluating different options, issuing the plan, and this is huge, adapting as you go. So it's not like a straight line.
Right.
It's more like, I don't know, a constantly spinning radar dish, always scanning and adjusting.
I like that, yeah.
Mhm.
And it's that adapting part that I think probably resonates with a lot of you Marines out there in the field. How often does everything go exactly according to plan?
Almost never,
Right.
especially in the field.
Especially when you're in a dynamic environment, yeah.
Absolutely, and that's why MCDP 5 bakes in this concept of replanning. Your initial plan is rarely the final word.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about the process. And once you sort of got a handle on the situation and your goals, MCDP 5 talks about two really, I think, important skills for effective planning. And they are analysis and synthesis. I was thinking about it this morning. Like, the difference between a mechanic who's taking apart an engine and an engineer who's, designing the entire system.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, analysis is about breaking things down, understanding all the components. Like you said, like a mechanic. It's about gathering intel,
Right.
getting the facts. Synthesis is then taking those pieces and putting them back together in a way that works.
Right.
So you need both. You need the mechanic and the engineer.
Right. So you can be really good at breaking things down. But
Yeah.
if you can't put them back together in a way that helps you achieve your mission, then you're kind of stuck.
Absolutely. Now, to help you with that, MCDP 5 introduces this concept of a planning hierarchy, and there are 3 levels: conceptual, functional, and detailed.
Okay, so conceptual, if I'm getting this right, is sort of the big picture.
Big picture, what are we trying to accomplish overall?
Right.
Functional is more about specific areas like logistics, fire support, intelligence, all those different moving pieces.
Oh, moving parts, yeah.
And then detailed is, really getting down into the nitty-gritty,
The weeds.
the weeds of exactly how things will
I
happen.
like it, yeah.
But the key here is that these levels aren't completely separate. Your big picture conceptual planning should really drive everything else.
Yeah.
So if your overall goal is to, let's say, capture a key objective,
Right.
that's going to dictate how you think about your logistics, what kind of fire support you need, all the way down to, the detailed level of what individual units are doing.
It's like a blueprint, I guess, for
Yeah.
how you're going to construct this building or, whatever it is you're trying to do. You don't just start laying bricks. You have to know what you're building and how it all fits together.
Exactly. And speaking of adapting to different situations, MCDP 5 acknowledges that planning isn't one size fits all.
Right.
And it introduces these 3 modes: commitment, contingency, and orientation.
Okay, so these modes really get at how much uncertainty there is in war. Right?
Absolutely.
And, orientation is almost like you're feeling your way through the dark. All right,
Yeah.
you don't have all the information, and things are changing. It's that really fluid environment.
Yeah, you're gathering information, you're staying flexible. That's a good way to put it. And then as things start to become a little bit clearer,
Yeah.
you might shift to contingency planning, where you're developing plans for a few of the most likely scenarios that you might face.
Right.
And then finally, when you've got a pretty solid understanding of the situation, you can move into commitment mode, where you're really putting all your resources behind one specific plan.
Right. You're committed at that point.
You're committed.
But even then, I mean, you've got to be ready to shift back, right? I mean, the situation can change very quickly.
Absolutely. Things can change in an instant, especially for Marines on the ground. You might have to go back to contingency or even orientation mode if something unexpected happens.
Right, totally. Okay, so that's interesting. You're talking about these modes and how they change. But then MCDP 5 also goes on to say that the level of detail in your plan and how far out you actually plan needs to also match the situation. It's about being adaptable, but it's also about, using your resources wisely.
Right.
It makes me think of that quote, that famous Patton quote, "A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan next week."
Absolutely.
So, there's obviously a balance there, right, between how detailed your plan is and how quickly you need to act. So how do you know when, good enough planning is actually good enough?
That's a great question, and that's where judgment and experience really come in. But MCDP 5 does give you a few helpful categories to think about. There's deliberate planning, which is, when you have time to prepare.
Right.
And then there's rapid planning, which is all about making fast decisions when time is of the essence.
Right. So planning a large-scale training exercise, if you have months to do that, that's deliberate. But reacting to an enemy attack, you have to do that rapidly. But I imagine it's not always that clear-cut, right?
You're right, and MCDP 5 acknowledges that. A lot of times you'll start with a deliberate plan, but then you have to switch gears and use those rapid planning skills as things unfold. They kind of work together.
So they're complementary in a sense. They're not mutually exclusive.
Exactly.
Okay, good. Good. So then that brings us to, I think, another really interesting set of tools. And those are, and you've probably heard of these, forward and reverse planning.
Right.
Forward planning is, I think, what most of us typically think of as planning. You're starting with where you are now, and then you map out the steps to get to where you want to be.
Yeah, it's like plotting a route on a map, step by step.
Okay. Reverse planning is a little different, though.
It is. You start with your end goal, and then you work backward, figuring out all the things that need to happen to get there. It's almost like solving a maze by starting at the finish line.
Right. Okay.
Interesting way to think about it.
So forward planning, it seems like, keeps you grounded in the present, right? Like what's possible now. But reverse planning allows you to make sure that, okay, you're actually on the right track to achieve that ultimate objective.
Precisely. And MCDP 5 suggests using both.
Okay.
Using forward planning to stay realistic about what's achievable.
Right.
And reverse planning to always keep your eye on the prize.
Okay. So we've got the process, we've got the skills, we've got the levels, the modes, these different planning approaches.
Right.
But what actually makes a good plan? What are the essential ingredients, according to MCDP 5?
Well, it boils down to 4 key things. Having a crystal clear picture of what you want to achieve and why, having the specific actions you need to take to get there, having the resources you'll need, and having a control process. A control process to manage everything and to make those adjustments as you go.
That control process part really jumped out at me because it's not enough to just make a plan and hope for the best.
Absolutely not.
You actually have to have mechanisms in place so that you can monitor your progress and, see whether things are going off track and then adjust on the fly.
Yeah, that's critical, especially in a fast-paced environment like combat where things are constantly changing.
Right. Okay, so that control process, I think, is a key piece of this.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about that, but then MCDP 5 also talks about this concept of tight and loose coupling. I'm just curious, what is that all about?
Yeah, so this is all about how much control you need to have over all the different elements of your plan.
Okay.
So in a tightly coupled plan, every single thing needs to happen in a specific sequence, kind of like a complex machine.
Okay.
Think of a synchronized airstrike, where timing is everything.
Oh, I see.
A loosely coupled plan is one that allows for more flexibility.
Oh.
Individual units or elements can adapt without necessarily messing up the whole operation.
So the difference between that airstrike where every piece has to fit together perfectly,
Right,
versus, I don't know, maybe a team of scouts who are fanning out to collect intel. They have a common objective, but they have a lot more freedom to adjust on the fly, depending on what they find.
Exactly. That's a great example, and MCDP 5 is very clear. The amount of coupling you need really depends on the situation. Sometimes you need that tight control,
Right.
and other times you need to give your units more room to maneuver.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And then kind of running throughout MCDP 5, there's this emphasis on simplicity.
Yeah.
keeping plans as simple as possible. Why is that so important, do you think? Especially, in a military context.
Well, think about it. The more complex a plan is, the harder it is for people to understand it, to communicate it effectively, and then to execute it in the heat of the moment.
Especially when people are under pressure, right?
Absolutely. You don't want Marines trying to decipher some convoluted plan
Right.
while they're in the middle of a firefight.
You want them to be able to react and make good decisions.
Exactly. They need something clear and concise.
So you have to keep it simple. But but isn't there a risk of oversimplifying too? I mean, what if this situation you're facing is just inherently complex?
That's a really good point. It's about finding that right balance.
The sweet spot.
The sweet spot, exactly, between simplicity and complexity. And that takes practice. It takes experience.
Right. So MCDP5 is really about finding that balance, isn't it? The right amount of detail, the right amount of control, the right mix of planning approaches.
You got it. And it all has to be tailored to the specific situation you're facing.
Right. There's no cookie cutter solution. Speaking of tailoring things, one thing I thought was really cool about MCDP5 is that they use this historical example to kind of illustrate a lot of these concepts in action. And that's General Allenby's Palestine campaign from World War I.
Allenby, yeah, he's a great example.
He was a master, I think, of adapting, to the ever-changing conditions of war, especially during his time.
Absolutely. And his campaign really is a masterclass in applying the principles of MCDP5.
Yeah, I mean, he was dealing with, a ton of different challenges, a lot of uncertainty.
Absolutely. He had to blend tight and loose coupling, deliberate and rapid planning, forward and reverse thinking, and he did it all seamlessly.
Yeah, he was really good at that.
It's a great example of how these concepts can actually lead to a decisive victory in a complex environment.
Right. So before we get too deep into Allenby's campaign, I think this would be a good place to pause and maybe take a break. So we've covered a lot in this first part of our MCDP5 deep dive.
We have.
We've explored the process of planning, talked about the importance of analysis and synthesis, these different levels and modes of planning.
Tight and loose coupling.
Tight and loose coupling, yeah.
A lot of good stuff.
We've got a lot more to unpack, though.
Absolutely.
So we'll pick it up in the next part.
Welcome back. So we're picking up our deep dive into MCDP5. Now, we've talked about how important it is to tailor your plan to the situation, but how do you actually do that? How do you account for all those different factors, all that uncertainty? Well, luckily, MCDP5 offers some guidance. It talks about these planning considerations, kind of like prompts, to help you think critically about the plan and make sure it's aligned with reality.
So it's not like a checklist of hard and fast rules.
Not really. More like a set of, lenses to view the plan through.
Okay. To make sure you're considering all the angles.
Exactly. And one of the most important considerations, and this probably won't surprise you, is really understanding the enemy.
Right.
Their capabilities, their intentions, what they're likely to do in response to your actions.
You got to get inside their heads.
You really do. Sun Tzu said it best, right? If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles.
Knowledge is power, as they say. But knowing your enemy is just the beginning, right? What else does MCDP5 say Marines should be thinking about when they're planning?
Well, time is almost always a factor.
Right.
You need to be realistic about how much time you have to plan, how long things will actually take to execute, and, how much time you can afford to give the enemy to react.
Time can be a real enemy itself, can't it? Sometimes you don't have the luxury of crafting this perfect plan. You gotta make decisions and move.
Absolutely. And that leads into another consideration, resources.
Yeah.
It's all about balancing what you need with what you actually have. Personnel, equipment, supplies, the whole 9 yards.
Kind of like budgeting, but instead of dollars and cents, you're dealing with troops and weapons and ammunition.
Exactly. It's all about making those tough choices, figuring out what to prioritize. Sometimes you might have to even adjust your objectives based on the resources you have available.
Right. You got to work with what you got.
You do. But it's not just about crunching numbers. It's also about the physical environment where the operation is going to take place. MCDP5 actually uses the term space for this.
See, so okay.
And it stresses how important it is to understand the terrain, the weather, all those factors that can affect both you and the enemy.
Yeah, I mean, a plan that works great in the desert might be a total disaster in the jungle. You have to adapt to the environment.
Exactly. It's about thinking critically about the environment and building that into your plan from the get-go.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, A big theme in NCDP-5 is really this idea of adaptation.
Absolutely.
It's less about creating this perfect plan and more about creating a plan that can bend and change as the situation changes.
That's it. Because war is unpredictable. MCDP5 acknowledges that. It's not about trying to control every single variable. It's about being flexible, being adaptable, constantly assessing the situation.
So how do you actually do that? How do you build that adaptability into your planning?
Well, MCDP5 offers some pretty specific techniques that can help. And one that I thought was really interesting is this idea of framing the problem.
Okay. Framing the problem. Sounds simple enough.
It does. But you'd be surprised how often it's overlooked. Framing the problem is all about clearly defining what it is you're actually trying to solve. Because in the real world, you're rarely handed a neat, tidy little problem, right?
Right.
It's usually messy. Competing priorities, incomplete information, unexpected challenges popping up left and right.
Trying to put together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing, and you don't even know what the picture's supposed to be.
That's a great analogy. So framing the problem is about cutting through all that noise, all the clutter, and getting to the core of the issue. MCDP5 suggests asking yourself some pretty basic but important questions like, what's the ultimate goal? What are the obstacles standing in your way? What are the factors that are most likely to influence the outcome? You know,
Asking the right questions is half the battle, isn't it?
often it is. And once you've got a handle on the problem, you've got it clearly defined, then the next step is to develop what MCDP5 calls a logical line of reasoning. This is essentially about connecting the dots between your actions and the desired outcome. Why are we doing this? How does it get us closer to the objective?
So you start with where you want to end up and work backward, outlining the steps. It's kind of like reverse planning, but with more of a focus on the why behind each step.
Exactly. Each step should flow logically into the next and ultimately lead you to that objective. And that line of reasoning needs to be clear to everyone involved.
Right, because a plan that makes perfect sense to the commander but not to the Marines who are actually executing it, that's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And then, to really test that logic, see how your plan might play out in the real world, MCDP5 encourages you to use a technique called wargaming.
Wargaming. Now, I've definitely heard that term before,
Mhm.
but I'm not sure I fully understand what it means in practice. What does it actually look like?
It's basically like a simulated battle where you're testing your plan against a hypothetical enemy.
Okay.
You know, this can be done on a map, with tabletop models, or even with computer simulations these days.
Ah, so it's like a dress rehearsal for the real thing, but instead of actors, you've got like miniature tanks and soldiers. You're trying out different approaches, seeing what works, identifying potential problems before you're actually out there in a real-world situation.
That's exactly it. And MCDP5 emphasizes that wargaming shouldn't just be a one-time thing. You know, you should be wargaming throughout the process, from the initial concept all the way through to execution.
Kind of like revising a paper, right? The more drafts you go through, the better the final product.
Exactly. And speaking of preparation, another key technique that MCDP5 highlights is intelligence preparation of the battlefield, or IPB.
Yeah.
This is about, doing your homework before the test, so to speak.
Okay, so IPB, it's all about gathering and analyzing information.
Exactly. Understanding the enemy, the terrain, the weather, anything that could impact the operation.
Right, so you're not going in blind.
You don't want to. It's a very systematic process where you're defining the battlefield environment, you're identifying the enemy's capabilities and their likely courses of action, and you're figuring out how all those factors, the terrain, the weather, the enemy, might affect both sides.
So it sounds pretty in-depth, but I can see how it would be incredibly valuable to have all that information going into the planning process. Knowledge really is power, isn't it?
It is. And all that knowledge you gain through IPB, it feeds directly into your planning decisions,
Right.
helping you develop a more effective, more adaptable plan. Now, in addition to these techniques, MCDP5 also lays out some general planning principles to guide you along the way. Think of these as kind of the core values, if you will, of good planning.
Okay, so if the techniques are the how-to, the principles are the why behind it all.
Exactly. And one of the most important principles is centralized planning, decentralized execution.
Okay, I've heard that one before. What does that mean exactly?
It means that the commander is ultimately responsible for overseeing the planning process. But subordinate leaders need to be empowered to make decisions, adapt on the fly during execution.
So it's about striking that balance between, like, top-down guidance and bottom-up initiative.
You got it. And that's especially crucial in the kind of fast-paced, fluid environment of modern warfare. You can't micromanage everything from the top down. You need Marines on the ground who can think for themselves and make adjustments as needed.
Which is why MCDP5 also stresses planning for uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
Knowing that you can't predict everything and building that flexibility into the plan from the start.
Absolutely. You're not trying to create a plan that will account for every single contingency. It's more about creating a plan that can be modified, adjusted as the situation changes.
A living document.
Exactly. And that ties into another principle, continuous assessment.
So you're not just setting the plan in motion and then walking away.
Not at all. Planning is an ongoing process. You're constantly monitoring, evaluating, adjusting.
It's starting to sound like MCDP5 is less about creating the perfect plan and more about creating a culture of adaptability, a culture of critical thinking within the Marine Corps.
You're getting it. And to foster that culture, you need to embrace another really important principle, simplicity.
Right, keep it simple.
We talked about that a bit earlier. The more complex the plan is, the harder it is to communicate effectively, the harder it is to execute, especially under pressure.
Keep it simple. Stupid, right?
Yeah.
But, there's got to be a balance. You don't want to oversimplify to the point where you're missing critical details.
Yeah.
So how do you find that sweet spot? How do you keep it simple enough to understand and execute, but not so simple that it's ineffective?
That's the million-dollar question. That's the art of good planning. It's finding that sweet spot between simplicity and complexity. And it takes practice. It takes experience.
Okay, so we've got the considerations, the techniques, the principles. Anything else we should touch on before we wrap up?
Yeah, one more thing. MCDP5 really emphasizes the human dimension of planning. It acknowledges that plans are executed by people, by Marines, and their morale, their training, the quality of their leadership, those things are absolutely critical to the success of any operation.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the technical details, right? The maps, the logistics, the timelines. But it's the human factor that ultimately makes or breaks a plan.
You're absolutely right. And MCDP5 encourages commanders to create a command climate that fosters initiative, innovation, adaptability.
So it's not just about giving orders. It's about empowering Marines to think critically, make decisions, really own the mission.
That's the essence of MCDP5. It's about giving Marines the tools and the mindset they need to plan and execute operations effectively in the complex and ever-changing environment of war.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We are in the home stretch now, wrapping up our exploration of MCDP5. I mean, we've covered so much.
We have everything from, that overall planning process to those specific techniques like wargaming and IPB.
Right.
We've even touched on some pretty big picture stuff like the human dimension of planning.
Right, the human element, absolutely, yeah. So, but before we kind of send you off to plan your next op, I think it's worthwhile to take a minute and just kind of recap, like, what are the big takeaways here? What are the things every Marine should remember about planning, according to MCDP5?
Yeah, good idea. I think the first thing that really jumps out at me is just how much MCDP5 stresses that planning, it's not a one-time event.
Right.
It is a cycle. You assess, you plan, you execute, you adapt, you do it all over again.
It's like a muscle you have to keep working out. you
Yeah.
know? You're constantly flexing, constantly adapting to the situation.
That's a great analogy. And another key takeaway is that planning, it's not a solo mission.
Right.
It's a team effort. Commanders, staff, subordinate leaders, everyone needs to be on the same page,
Yeah.
working together to develop the best possible plan.
And it can't stop there, right? I mean, once the plan is made,
Right.
you still got to be collaborating, communicating,
Absolutely.
sharing information, adapting together
Mm-hmm.
as the situation unfolds.
It's like like a basketball team, right? You need everyone working together, passing the ball, reacting to the defense.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So I think that gets at another really important point, which is just the importance of communication, right?
Absolutely.
Just making sure that everyone from the top down to the Marines on the front line, they understand the plan.
Yeah.
No room for confusion when, lives are on the line.
No room for error. Cut the jargon, be direct, make sure everyone knows their role,
Yeah.
how it fits into the bigger picture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, MCDP5 does a good job of reminding us that planning is not just about following orders
Right.
or checking boxes. It's about empowering Marines to think critically, to make decisions in the field, to take initiative.
Yeah, it's about trusting Marines to adapt and overcome, even when things get really tough, when they're
Yeah.
facing those unexpected challenges.
They're throwing a curveball.
Yeah,
Exactly.
That's the heart of MCDP5, I think. It's about giving Marines the tools and the mindset they need to succeed.
In the unpredictable world of war.
In the unpredictable world of war, yeah. exactly.
So as you guys continue on your journey in the Marine Corps,
Yeah.
just remember that, MCDP 5, it's not just some, dusty old manual to be memorized. It's a roadmap, it's a toolkit,
Like a
a
guide.
guide, yeah, for navigating the complexity of planning and frankly of leading Marines in those really challenging situations.
Yeah, study it.
Yeah.
Internalize its principles and apply them in your training, in your exercises, and when the time comes in real world ops.
When the time comes, yeah.
Yeah.
And MCDP 5, it's really all about, giving you that edge, that flexibility, the mental agility to make the right call when it matters most.
Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
Accomplishing the mission,
And bringing your Marines home safe.
bringing those Marines home safe.
Well said. Well said. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive on MCDP 5.
I think so.
Thanks for joining us, and Semper Fi.